Hello there and welcome to the video. Today I'm going to be starting a new series of videos called How to Buy the Computer. I could probably work on the title a bit, where I teach you pretty much everything that you'd need to know when buying a computer. Or in other words, basically just going through the product page of a computer and saying what all of the stuff means. Now I'd just like to preface this video by saying that this information can be used when buying pretty much any computer. So whether it be a desktop or a laptop or a phone, kinda. Or if you're looking to build your own computer and you're buying all of the parts individually. Also, to the lucky people who are watching this in the future, when I've already made all the videos in the series, either in the top right corner or in the link in the description below, to a nice playlist of all the videos in the series. And to all the people watching when this video comes out, and I haven't made the other videos yet, well, you're gonna have to wait. And so to start off, we're going to be tackling the CPU, or the Central Processing Unit. You just take your CPU and just... Oh. Anyways, the CPU is, in very basic terms, the brain of the computer. As its name would suggest, it does a lot of processing that a computer would need to do. And how it does this processing is through calculations. And so that brings us to the first specification of a CPU, that being the clock speed. To put it simply, the clock speed is how often a CPU does a calculation per second. And so the more calculations a CPU can do per second, generally, the faster it is. Now there is more to it than just higher clock speeds mean faster processors. There's a lot more to a CPU than that. But this is generally listed as one of the main selling points when it comes to the speed or performance of a computer or CPU on the product page. The clock speed is measured in hertz. And now you know how you have megabytes and gigabytes when measuring storage? Well, you also have megahertz and gigahertz when measuring clock speed. And so a CPU advertised as 1 gigahertz means that it can do 1 billion calculations per second. Or in the case of the CPU that I have in my computer, which is at 3.2 gigahertz, that means it will do 3.2 billion calculations per second. The next selling point that you'll see for the speed or the power of a CPU would be how many cores it has. A core is basically just a processing unit. And so you can have one processing core doing calculations, and then you can have another processing core doing equally as difficult calculations at the same time. What this results in is basically double the performance. So say for example you have two CPUs both running at the same clock speeds. One of them has a dual core, dual meaning 2, and one of them's a quad core, quad meaning 4. The quad core is basically going to be about double the dual core. And then an octo core, octo meaning 8, is going to be double a quad core, and then a 16 core is going to be double an 8 core, and so on and so on and so on and so on. Now when talking about cores, you also have to talk about threads. Now the best way to describe threads would be as virtual cores. So imagine taking a core and cutting it in half virtually with code. This is called multi-threading, or as Intel calls it, hyper-threading. And so what this means is that the computer sees each core as two virtual cores, and so it treats them as two cores. Now, I'm not a CPU manufacturer, so I'm not even going to pretend to know how this fully works. But as the average customer of a computer or a CPU, you pretty much just need to think as hyper-threading or multi-threading as kind of a middle ground between less cores and straight up physical cores. So say for example I have a dual core, and I also have a dual core with multi-threading. The one with multi-threading will be faster than the one without multi-threading. So the dual core without multi-threading has 2 cores, whereas the one with multi-threading has 4 virtual cores in 2 physical cores. However, if we bring in an actual 4-cored CPU, that will be faster than a dual core with hyper-threading. And the same with a quad core and an octo core. You can have a quad core with 8 threads, or an 8 core with 8 threads, the 8-core will perform better. Okay, you're probably fed up with me saying the word core by now, so we're going to move on and talk about the CPU cache. No, the cache of a CPU is not how much money it has, it's a different spelling. You've got cache and you've got cache. Different. The CPU cache is pretty much just the buffer between the RAM, or random access memory, which we'll talk about in a later video in the series, and the CPU. So the data that the CPU currently needs to do the processing that it's doing will be stored in cache for fast access. And because the cache is so close, as it's part of the CPU, that means it could be accessed quicker than accessing data from the RAM. Now, there's a bit more to it than that. There's like different levels of cache that you can have, but the basic gist of it is the more cache you have and the faster the cache is, the quicker the CPU can access the data that it needs. Simple as that. Now, the things mentioned so far would apply to somebody buying a pre-built or a laptop, or buying their own CPU individually. However, there are a couple more things that you would need to consider when buying a CPU individually if you were building your own computer. First one being the CPU socket. You're going to want to make sure that the motherboard and the CPU have the same socket so that they can work together. And there will be another video in the series later on about how to choose the right motherboard, so we'll go into more depth then. And the second thing being how much power the CPU consumes, also known as the thermal design power, or TDP. The TDP of a CPU is measured in watts and determines how much power needs to be running through the CPU for it to function. So the more power and more electricity running through it, the higher the wattage. And so first of all, you're going to want to make sure that the power supply can provide enough power to the CPU and all the other components in the system. And alongside with more electricity and power running through the CPU, the more heat it will produce. And so you're going to want to make sure that you get a cooler that can handle the amount of wattage that your CPU consumes. Otherwise, your CPU may overheat and not perform correctly. And so that's it. That's pretty much all you'd need to know as an average consumer buying a computer or a CPU. And so thank you all for watching. If you'd like to be notified when future videos in this series get made, feel free to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications, and I'll see you then. Oh, and shout out to MFW0071 or my friend Matt. Run, 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 run.